Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Connected Automated Vehicles Are Coming, a discussion on how to prepare a webinar. My name is Jennifer Bartashis, and I'm a Senior Equity Research Analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence. I'm going to be today's moderator as we discuss the impacts of CAVs and how businesses and other organizations can prepare for this really exciting shift in technology. Throughout today's discussion, please don't hesitate to send questions in the chat, and we'll make sure that we address them at the end. Today, we've got three amazing panelists, and they're going to introduce themselves in just a moment. But to get things rolling, I'd like to do a quick poll to get a sense of where everyone listening in today is with regards to CAV adoption. So if you could take a moment to indicate your organization and what you're planning to do with regards to CAV, that would be great. And while everyone's doing that, I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Brian. Brian?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. My name is Brian Burkhardt. I'm the Global Technology Lead for Advanced Mobility Systems, which includes things like intelligent transportation systems, connected, autonomous, and electric vehicles, and road user charging.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tim Dawkins. I'm responsible for autonomous vehicle research at the World Economic Forum, and I lead a number of our policy advisory work projects where we advise governments on these technologies as well.
Hi everyone, my name is Brad Jacobs. I'm the Director of Fleet Consulting at Merchants. I've been in the fleet management industry for a little over 15 years, and I'm responsible for our client consulting and our analytical functions within the fleet space.
All right, wonderful. And if we could close the poll, let's take a look at what we got here with regards to answers. And so it looks like a lot of people are actively evaluating CAV now, which is great because that means that you've got a lot that we can learn from today's topics. I just want to throw it out to the panel. Is anybody surprised by the results of the poll here?
I'm a little curious that there are a few at the bottom there that are not thinking about this technology, but they're at this webinar, so maybe we'll change some minds over the next hour or so.
Excellent. All right. Did anyone else want to weigh in? Sorry.
Doesn't surprise me that we have more at the top, but like Tim, hopefully we can persuade the folks at the bottom to rethink that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we're hearing from a lot of organizations that we deal with also. And a lot of people are in the exploratory phase right now and just getting a sense of what's what.
All right. All right, so let's set the stage. And to do that, I'd like to take just a quick minute and do a little bit of a level set so that we're all on the same page for the entire conversation here. So Brian, could you do us a favor and could you briefly explain the differences between and the connection points between connected automated vehicles and autonomous vehicles?
Yeah, sure. So when we're talking about connected vehicles, we're talking about vehicles that talk to each other. And by talking, we mean by wireless communications. And also with infrastructure. So the first part we call V2V, and the second part we call V2I, or vehicle to infrastructure. And that can be done through what is referred to as dedicated short-range communications radios. Also cellular counts as a means of communicating between vehicles and infrastructure. And as autonomous vehicles came on the scene, again, it's always been something that's been talked about on and off over the decades. The benefits from automated vehicles, and automated meaning not entirely being able to drive by themselves, but having the abilities and sensing to move through traffic or through whatever based on sensing equipment, started to become conflated with connected because this saying goes, automated vehicles are only as good as they're connected. Automated vehicles give you a sense of your immediate surroundings, whereas connectivity gets you information beyond, the visual horizon. So together, connected and automated vehicles, CAV, promises to bring a whole new type of opportunities to vehicles. Autonomous, on the other hand, is what we refer to completely driverless. And there are things like shared autonomous shuttles that have no steering wheel, no gas pedal, no brake, and those vehicles literally drive by themselves with no human intervention at all.
that's really great. And I think that actually sets up a really great segue into our first main discussion area, which is the operational impacts of CAV. And so to kick off this part of the conversation, what are some of the impacts that you're seeing right now of CAVs? And Brad, maybe we could start with you and you could talk to us about your perspective.
Sure. We're seeing companies and people really embracing safety and semi-autonomous features that are enabled within the vehicle. Features like automatic emergency braking, lane departure assist, they're becoming more and more standard when companies are making specification decisions on their vehicles that they're going to put into their fleet, but also being able to take a deeper dive into what the driver's doing behind the wheel. And the goal is to use that behavior information in such a way as to provide an even safer experience over and above what the vehicle can provide itself. And that information empowers an organization to have that dialogue with that driver to ultimately either improve their loss rates as an organization, reduce their costs. So that's one. And another area of focus is managing the order to delivery process. So most companies will order their vehicles directly from the manufacturer, and there's a keen focus on how long it takes to receive a vehicle from the time that an order is placed. So connected vehicles, they're now providing visibility to the asset from the time it leaves the plant until the time it's delivered to the driver at the dealership. And the goal is to compress that time frame as much as possible. And using the information coming from the connected vehicle, it removes bottlenecks, it can remove roadblocks from the process, and getting that vehicle into a revenue generating activity for the company as fast as possible. It's becoming more and more of a reality.
That makes a lot of sense. And Brian, do you have any kind of use case scenarios that you can share with us from your experience?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of companies making use of brokered third-party data. So as Brad alluded to, some of these vehicles are coming off the production line with connectivity immediately. And there's some companies that are taking care of a full fleet of opt-in information from drivers that allows you to get real detailed origin destination information, and we'll get into this later, but that's big data that allows you a lot of information that can be used for many different purposes and use cases. And we are actually working with Cambridge Systematics on a project for LA Metro that is called Draflex, and is using third-party data that's very specific to truckers. And this will allow users of this smartphone system to get real detailed information on their deliveries and being able to make decisions on the fly based on the information we're providing them on their routes, their pickup drop-off points, where they can pick up their next load. So we're really seeing this today as a changing factor in goods delivery.
Interesting. And Brad, did you have any other comments you wanted to add on to there about pre versus post delivery, or did we cover what you wanted to say?
No, I think we covered it. I think there's a tremendous opportunity from an operational process efficiency, and I know that from our customers' perspective and a lot of the organizations that we talk to, there can be just a tremendous benefit there, in addition to what Brian had alluded to around the trucking space.
So when we're talking about connected technology embedded into the vehicle, what does that mean for the life of the vehicle? And does that have any kind of impact on vehicle replacement? So Brad, can you kind of continue along with what you'd been talking about and just talk to us a little bit about this idea?
Yeah, on the replacement side, the cost of the connected vehicle capabilities, it's much lower than a traditional third-party or aftermarket hardware. It's providing much more practical data to use than we've had in the past. There's certainly benefits around administration because there's no longer a need to install and deinstall a device. And you couple that with an overall better experience for the driver, which improves their satisfaction with the vehicle, and improves their satisfaction with the organization, et cetera, all those different factors. So the impact of that will be we're already seeing it more and more with organizations right now, is wanting to get as many of those vehicles in service as fast as possible. because they recognize both the economic and management benefits they provide, and they don't want to miss out, on an opportunity. So a lot of older assets that are out there, there's significant dialogue and action around ordering new assets and bringing those capabilities into the fold.
Okay. And Brian, maybe you can help us out and talk a little bit about just that, the dependency on hardware solutions versus software, and what's going on in that space.
Yeah. And, to tag on to what Brad is saying, the challenge is definitely the legacy vehicles for sure. But as new vehicles are being made, you can optimize how they're produced by allowing changes to happen through firmware upgrades that can be done over the air. So when you have features that are less dependent upon hardware solutions, more dependent upon software, that enables that. By way of example, a shared autonomous vehicle company called Local Motors, all of their features are entirely software upgradable. So they could, their new version of the Ollie vehicle 2.0 will allow on the fly, over the air updates for many different features that allow connected applications to take place.
All right, and Tim, let's pull you into the conversation here. Why don't you share with us your thoughts when you're looking at the software aspect of these vehicles?
Sure. So, as we shift from these legacy vehicle architectures that are defined by, the chassis and the powertrain and the engine and everything else, to the next generation of vehicle architectures, which are actually designed from day one to be software focused, a software defined vehicle architecture. Then you're able to engineer a vehicle that fundamentally almost every module in that vehicle can be connected to the TCU, the telematics unit, and updated over the air. So with that design ethos in mind, you're actually able to quite substantially not only extend the life of the vehicle, because you're able to offer potential software fixes and software updates down the road, but you can also increase the efficiency of it by say adding patches for battery usage or fuel consumption, things like that, and even potentially upsell features down the line. So the vehicle may leave the factory with one set of hardware, but you're able to enable features as they become available, or to second or third owners, and sort of upsell them. So the OEMs are looking at this. Yes, it's a bit of a paradigm shift away from sheet metal and transmissions and engines and things to becoming software engineers, but it does unlock new revenue streams for them and new opportunities to understand their vehicle better throughout their usage as well.
Actually, that's a great point, and it makes me really think about this evolution of moving from kind of the nuts and bolts into technology, and it makes me wonder about what the impact is on drivers and employees, and if there's additional training that has to happen. Do you have to account for new skill sets in order to interpret this data? And Brian, maybe you could weigh in on this for me.
Yeah, I'll touch on 2 points. The first deals with the equipment. For example, the one way to address connectivity is to bring in what we call aftermarket devices, in this case, dedicated short-range communications radios. And agencies like Delaware DOT are bringing in these type of radios into the vehicles, and their own staff are working on that, and it's helping them get trained on this and understand the type of data that can be ingested. On the other hand, when it comes to the data and how that's being brought in and consumed, one of the challenges that DOTs will have is this transition from bricks and mortar to technology. And for the first time ever, we're seeing DOTs put out ads for data scientists. And so this is a different way of addressing on how a DOT is seen and operating. We're seeing this on a daily basis with all of our clients.
Interesting. And Brad, maybe from from an operator perspective, and from your customers that you're talking to, what are your thoughts on this in terms of training and skill sets?
Yeah, I mean, very, very similar to what Brian was mentioning around, data scientists. The overarching key is honing in on the information that's meaningful, that carries some sort of an opportunity, and then separating that from what's just the noise. And the connected vehicle, it's got a plethora of this information that we never even saw even just 2 or 3 years ago. And the focus an organization needs to have on this information is changing, and it will continue to change. The people who are managing the assets, they have to adapt to get the most out of that information. So, the key is it's centered around not only how to interpret the data, but in understanding how an organization's data stacks up against a benchmark or against vehicles that are in similar applications or being used in a similar fashion. And then from there, determining where that opportunity lies within a specific operation. It's going to be different for everybody. Every organization is different in how they use their assets in the line of business that they're in. So fleet professionals, they're embracing the reality that they do need to be more analytically minded in the past in order to do that, and also rely on their partners to an even greater extent to help.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think everyone these days is always looking for those partnerships that will help enhance the organization, but not have to reinvent your own organization. But when we're talking about data, it just seems that with all of this data that CAVs can potentially offer to help improve operations, drive efficiencies, that it might push organizations into this having to be big data savvy. So let's talk about that subject for a little bit. And I'd like to start off by asking about, the balance and maintaining a balance between privacy and having the data that you need, and how you ensure that CAV vehicles are safe from cyber attacks, but are also compliant with data privacy regulations. And Tim, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about current regulations and what you're seeing.
Sure thing. So there's two main areas of concern. Number one, as you mentioned, there's the privacy aspect, and then secondly, there's cybersecurity. And these are governed in separate ways, although there's a quite substantial amount of crossover, obviously, as I'm sure you can imagine. And privacy regulations in particular have changed massively in recent years. Take the examples of GDPR in Europe, the California Consumer Protection Act here, Consumer Privacy, sorry. And then, just this week we've seen the EU-US Privacy Shield be repealed because it's was deemed unsuitable. So privacy regulation is a constantly changing landscape that every organisation has to deal with in some way, shape, or form, and that's doubly true if you've got connected vehicles out on the road and you're collecting data from that. And then separately on the cybersecurity front, there's actually less in terms of concrete policy at the moment. Here in the US, NHTSA have published voluntary guidance on cybersecurity best practice, and there are a number of activities at the SAE and other various industry groups are taking to develop and share baseline standards for cybersecurity for connected vehicles. But that's not to say that there's not been plenty of activity in this space already. I mean, over the last 5 years, everyone from automakers to telematic service providers and suppliers have been investing very heavily in developing cybersecurity solutions, whether that's on the hardware side, on the vehicle network side, or on the the back end, the cloud, and the network architecture, to provide secure solutions ahead of the lack of regulation that we have. So whilst the privacy landscape is kind of constantly changing and a big headache for almost any company these days, there's plenty of activity on the cybersecurity front, at least from the industry, to ensure that these things are secure enough for the time being.
Excellent. And Brian, I know that this is also a topic that you spend a lot of time thinking about. So can you share with us your perspective?
Yeah, I think the trend has been that they're honestly security or cybersecurity is an afterthought. Now, there has been quite a number of things that have been done to standardize, as Tim mentioned, where there's standardization from IEEE, the Society of Automotive Engineers, SAE, that help to keep data safe and encryption methodologies. But we're seeing now, for example, procurements, public procurements on connected vehicle systems having a tremendous amount of focus on cybersecurity. Many are asking for $5 million insurance policies as people step into this area. So, they're putting the onus on the developers to make sure that these systems are safe. So I think the trajectory is much heightened sense of awareness on the need to have cybersecurity built into these solutions, for sure.
Excellent. And you know, now that we have kind of a sense of like, you know, all this, the security and this sort of thing, and we're getting all this data. And so what do you do with it? And so Brad, I'd like to kick it over to you and just say, you know, what is it that companies need to do to get the most out of all this data once they've got it in their hands?
Yeah. Well, obviously, you know, it all starts with evaluating all the KPIs and the information and understanding where the opportunities lie, kind of as we already mentioned. That's kind of a given. But the key to getting the most out of it is to communicate and socialize that information within the organization. And, you know, the why must be communicated, so to speak, right? So why are we targeting this? Why is this an opportunity for us? What are we doing that is causing these types of behaviors that we're seeing through the data? So to that end, you know, setting goals is key. The goals need to be clear. They need to be achievable. They need to be meaningful to a company's bottom line or their culture, or tie into you know, a larger company-wide initiative, as an example. And doing that is what drives that organizational buy-in. And that buy-in, it's not just from the leadership level where it's needed. It's really from all levels, and it needs to be attained to achieve the greatest impacts. And you know, so communicating the why through the goals and through all the data that we have available to us, it's really essential to success.
And it makes sense because you really need to help people manage and understand that it's not a big type application where people want to see what you're doing, but to have those incentives to help the organization profit from the, you know, the data that you get out of it. And so it's interesting you talk about helping the culture evolve and having those metrics. And Brian, you know, what do you have to add to this?
Yeah, I would say that anyone that's listening here, some folks may not even know what big data is, right? And the best way to do it is, you know, back in the day, a fleet manager or anyone making use of data might be using an Excel spreadsheet. And, you know, that gets you maybe hundreds of data points that you might use to make some decisions, business decisions. Well, now with the ability to get tremendous amounts, you know, terabytes of data, you have so much data that you, as a human, you just couldn't possibly make anything of it. And what artificial intelligence and analytics allow you to do is to basically dip the ladle into that big data soup and make inferences from it. So there's plenty of information that you probably don't even know you have that can give you insights on how you're operating your business and how you might optimize and improve your bottom line that you just have no idea because you're human. So I think that's one of the key takeaways I would recommend to folks as they're listening here.
Okay. And so we've got vehicles that are, they're taking in all this data, but they're also taking in data from their surroundings. And so the question that I have on this is, you know, how do you anonymize vehicle to vehicle data and either avoid getting external environmental data that you shouldn't have, or how do you mitigate the risk around, you know, exposure to that data? And more importantly, who owns it? You know, because that's always one of the perpetual questions. But Tim, can you start off with your thoughts here?
Sure. So vehicle-to-vehicle communications, by their very nature, are not something that you should have to be concerned about in terms of privacy. So vehicle-to-vehicle communications usually follow some sort of standardized protocol, whether they're cellular-based or DSRC-based. Protocols are slightly different, and the type of information that you get is slightly different. But usually, in the cellular application, you know, at its most rich form, the data shared from one vehicle to another will be things like my location, whether my windscreen wipers are on, is it raining, have I got traction, things like that. So these are all safety related things which are quite detailed, but they're not in any way personally identifiable information. You can't even drill it down to the VIN level. So that's to say that vehicle to vehicle communications aren't really a big concern. Now, fleet data, as I'm sure many people on the call today know, is very different. You know, you do have VIN level information, you've got things about drivers and stuff like that, and is an entirely separate implication, I guess, in terms of privacy. But again, that's treated and handled much differently rather than vehicle-to-vehicle communications.
All right, and Brian, can you talk to us a little bit about some of the standards that are in place that you are having to deal with or that you're aware of?
Yeah. Just to take to getting in a little deeper from what Tim mentioned here, when we're talking about the connected vehicle framework that's been established for vehicle-to-vehicle and vehicle infrastructure, there's something that's called the basic safety message by way of example, one of many messages. That's the heart of what a vehicle is broadcasting. It's a 10 hertz signal that basically gives you trajectory information on where you're at in the world. Now that's completely an anonymous data bit that allows, that's focused more on safety, right? And so those bits of data, that's the framework provides protections around making sure that you don't know who the person is creating that signal. On the other hand, the flip side is the data that is being used for fleet management. That would be an opt-in, and that would be more of a private network. And so the communications that are being done there and the type of applications that are being used, you do need to know who's on the other end there. So you would have driver information, possibly even load information. So a bit different there, but both would have to have some type of, definitely some cyber construct around that to protect that data and the systems.
All right, and Brad, from an organizational perspective, what are your thoughts?
And it all ties back to what's in an organization's fleet policy. So the concepts that both Tim and Brian were discussing and outlining around what a fleet intends to do with the information, what will be measured, and clearly communicating the expectations in the policy is really what's key. So we've seen some organizations even go so far as to require individual driver signed acknowledgements. This information is being reviewed and it's being looked at by their organization. And then completely on the opposite end of the spectrum, some clients that we've seen are using gamification around incenting behaviors that tie to a fleet policy as a way of positive reinforcement, and using that strategy can be very effective as well.
All right. So just a quick reminder for everyone listening in, if you do have any questions, please go to the chat function and drop them in there, and we'll make sure that we get to them as we get closer to the end of the session. But with all this background on the operational impact and the data potential and the concerns around that data, I'd like to shift the conversation just a bit to talk about more of the nuts and bolts of being prepared for this and being prepared for adopting CAV. So, in terms of being prepared to shift into this technology, what are operators looking for in connected technology? And Brad, maybe you could just kind of continue on with some of your thoughts with regards to what you're hearing from your clients.
Sure. I think from an organizational perspective, operators, they're looking for that seamless experience across all OEMs, right? They don't want to have different management processes or different systems for different vehicle nameplates. So therefore, the aggregation and the normalization of that data and of the processes to enroll an asset or disenroll an asset, they're really come to the forefront and are of the highest importance. So, GM and Ford, they're clearly ahead of others in that regard. And, I'd say operators are excited about being able to manage areas of fleet using the information that they've never had access to before, in addition. Things like fuel levels or lockouts, brake life, recalls, certain diagnostic data, they're all very meaningful areas of focus, but it all ties back to that goal of driving revenue within a vehicle while reducing the operating costs for the company.
Got it. And Tim, can you share your thoughts here on this area?
Yeah. So one of the trends we see on the OEM side is that they're trying to really own the entire solution from their end. So they're not interested in just offering a piece of this this kind of service offering. Many of them are actually trying to offer the entire connected interface, as well as the hardware, the vehicles, the customer portal, if you will, all of that in one piece. And part of the reason for that is they want to kind of own that value chain as well as the relationship with the customer. So whilst they're able to, get the customer on board with their tools and their portals, say, for accessing all this data, they're also able to infer a lot more information about how the vehicles are used, how the vehicles are performing throughout their service life, and potentially, when those vehicles are coming up for replacement, they're able to get more insights into. They may be able to tell that before the customer knows it as well. So this represents tremendous value to the OEM, because obviously there's a potential sales advantage, but they're also looking at ways of monetizing that data and retaining additional value on the back of building that competence. And as was mentioned, GM are a great example of an organization that's done this. They've had OnStar in their portfolio since the 90s, and around that whole connected services offering, they've built all these competencies around fleet management, around remote vehicle diagnostics, over-the-air software updates, et cetera, that they are continuing to own, and is really kind of viewed as a core competence for the organization today.
Wow. It's always fascinating to me to hear about how this evolves, because I remember when OnStar came out in the back in the 90s, I was like, who needs this? It's cool. But I never could have envisioned where we were headed from there. But to kind of continue on, what are some of the most common questions that you guys are hearing about, connected, the connected vehicles? And so, Brian, maybe we could start with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So most of my clients tend to be public agencies, public DOTs, and the biggest question is, frankly, when is this going to happen? And what do they need to do to get ready? And part of that is a discussion on, okay, how much of this requires the DOTs to make investments on infrastructure? And this gets a little bit complicated, but there are some things with our governments right now, federally, that are kind of inhibiting the movement of DSRC a bit. There's some fight with the FCC over the radio spectrum that's being used for the safety ban. So that, unfortunately, that has kind of stalled things as far as mandates are concerned. So the opportunities that could be had through these vehicles is yet to come. What we advise our public clients is definitely plan for it and have that as part of your efforts. Pilots are a big thing too, and I think that's why you see advanced organizations like LA Metro, North Central Texas COG, Florida, all of these governments are making significant amount of investments to explore this. They see the opportunities, they see the benefits. Another question is, how much is it going to cost me? And when we don't know what's necessarily going to be installed yet, that's a little bit hard to answer, but this is what these pilots are helping. They're helping to prove these systems out. And, at first those costs will be high, but once they become part of the fabric of what we're building in our infrastructure, which is the end goal here, I think, the costs will go down.
All right. And Brad, again, from a fleet management perspective, what are you hearing?
Well, very, very similar to Brian. It's, when is connected technology going to be more mainstream? When is the information going to become, seamless across all the manufacturers and the supply chain? So those have been the biggest questions. Also, how the connected vehicle information, how can it also positively impact other services or other programs that a vehicle may be utilizing? So as an example, how long was the vehicle in shop for service? Now I can start managing downtime, and suppliers can start managing their vendors to get vehicles preferenced or pushed to the head of the line, as an example, and get that vehicle back on the road. Also from a fuel perspective, was the vehicle fueling at the location that it was actually at when it purchased fuel? So, those are all value adds that are being looked at from the client perspective, as when are they going to become more and more mainstream? There's a lot of value there. So, the big question is, when can we put some of those practices into play?
All right. And the question that a lot of people in the audience may have is just, what do I need to do today to prepare for this? And so from a government and more of a government perspective, Tim, do you have anything to add in here?
Broadly, there's not a lot of specific barriers to the technology from the government perspective, other than the lack of action. So, as Brian mentioned, DSRC has long since been protected for by Department of Transportation policy, and they made the spectrum allocation over a decade ago. And yet the problem is there's very little benefit to this technology unless it's widely deployed. So with short of actually a mandate from the government side saying that either these things have to be, the DSRC hardware has to be installed on every new vehicle, or local, departments of transportation or municipalities have to invest in putting roadside hardware in place, or maybe both of those things, then DSRC itself isn't actually going to take off as a technology. And probably my read of the tea leaves is that will continue to be the case for the foreseeable future. Now looking to the cellular side of things, as we move into a 5G world and we're afforded greater connectivity and faster connection speeds, then there's a possibility that cellular vehicle-to-vehicle connectivity becomes much more feasible for safety applications, and that doesn't require any additional policy changes. The same question it remains that this technology isn't really useful from a fleet. When I say fleet, I mean everybody on the road. Isn't really useful for a safety perspective until you have a large amount of penetration in the market. But there are benefits to the fleet operators, folks on this call, to deploying this across their fleets. As Brad mentioned, there's lots of insights that you can generate from upfitting your vehicles with these services.
All right. And Brad, did you have anything you wanted to add, since we had a nice little reference to what you've been talking about?
Yeah, I'd say, as a fleet operator, continue to stay on the cusp of what's coming and what the capabilities are. We're seeing manufacturers providing more and more information through the connected capabilities, month by month, week by week. The other thing is stay close with your OEM reps, and in many cases, we're starting to see a lot of pilot offerings coming into the marketplace as well. So offering up to be a pilot for a connected vehicle capability, or perhaps a new feature within an existing connected vehicle offering, it's a great way not only to define what the future looks like, and you have direct input into that process, but you can bring those things back to your company in terms of value.
All right. And understanding what we need to do is to kind of prepare is really helpful, but and so thank you all for that. But as we know, technology just keeps changing all the time. So we'd be a little bit remiss if we didn't talk about what to expect with the road ahead. So if I want to pick your brains a little bit and just talk about, what in your perspective, do the next 5 years look like in CAV? And Brian, why don't you kick us off with this?
Yeah, well, part of the reason we've been having conversations with Merchants Fleet is a shared interest and understanding that we feel that the next big move will be in goods movement. And I think that is supported by the US DOT. They've put out, and also organizations like AASHTO, who've put out the Connected Fleet Challenge, which is aiming to get more and more fleets connected, because there is a lot to be had that goes to beyond what we are seeing with the typical pilots, which has been safety and mobility. This is, goods movement has very significant economic impacts that just go beyond some of the original aspirations for connected vehicles. So I would say that that the bulk of the progress in these next years will be through heavy-duty trucks. For the increasing demand for on-time delivery, I think COVID is going to be actually one of the bright spots in this, is that the goods movement industry has had to step it up, right? Because we're not going to stores. Everything's being brought to us now. So this is just going to filter out and just create this huge wave of need, the mother of invention, right? So I think that's really what we are seeing as the next big push of the next 5 years. Interesting.
And Tim, maybe you could weigh in here with a little bit in terms of that shift in that last mile delivery that Brian just mentioned, and carry that forward a little bit more for us.
Absolutely. So in the autonomous vehicle sector, so the kind of really further looking applications, there's been a massive paradigm shift. So prior to the pandemic, a lot of the investment in autonomous vehicle development was focused on autonomous mobility. So ride sharing services, things like that. And since this pandemic, it's kind of turned everything on its head and forced every single autonomous vehicle company to pivot to logistics and last mile delivery applications. So everybody from Waymo through to, you know, tiny little startups that are all over the Bay Area are suddenly focused on everything from Class 8 trucks all the way down to sidewalk robots for applying their autonomous vehicle technologies. And so, yeah, as Brian mentioned, it's really been a powerful paradigm shift to logistics and distribution of goods. And quite conveniently, this also represents a more compelling business case for this technology, because the hardware is very expensive. You know, you're adding hundreds of thousands of dollars potentially in hardware just to a single vehicle, as well as all of the software development costs. And it's a much easier business case to justify than a ride-sharing service, because, well, you're used to dealing with more expensive vehicles in the logistics space. So yeah, one of the things that we anticipate in the next 5 years is we'll see, well, in the next 12 months, probably more piecemeal pilots of trucking and delivery applications of autonomous vehicles, and those will slowly scale up to perhaps larger hub-to-hub logistics operations by, you know, major operators. So yeah, really a big kind of paradigm shift over to delivery and autonomous vehicles.
All right. And Brad, last but not least, what are your thoughts on the next 5 years?
Yes, it'll become much more mainstream, obviously, but, you know, organizations, they're going to be looking at different manufacturers and looking at their connected capability as more of a differentiator. I know what Tim was alluding to earlier. We know that the manufacturers know this, because we're already seeing focus and emphasis put on these net new capabilities, particularly when we're in dialogue with organizations where we know that information is very highly valued to them. So we're already starting to see that. We'll definitely see more of it. But, you know, looking down the road a little bit, this may be a little bit longer than 5 years, but you could realistically foresee things where a vehicle becomes a virtual wallet, right? So as a driver pulls up to a fuel location or a maintenance location, the vehicle itself becomes a method of payment, and all of that transactional data is processed through the connected capabilities. Now, I think as it becomes more and more mainstream, and as more and more of the infrastructure is put in place around the offering, people are going to be doing some pretty neat and innovative things that with that information that I'm sure we haven't even thought of yet.
I tend to agree with you there, because the creativity is.
Oh, we lost our host.
And research and development around CAV. And Brian, maybe you could start us off here.
Sorry, you cut out there. Can you repeat the question?
Yep, sorry. So, you know, what are some of the keys to encouraging organizations to invest in CAV technology and R&D behind that?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, so their governments are placing their interest and are placing their investments are things like that they can have impacts on both legacy and connected and automated vehicles, I guess. And so in good transfer locations like ports, when you're talking about the ports of call along the West Coast, you know, Port of Oakland is a port that has made a lot of investments in improving the technology that is used to help trucks move more freely through that important port, and you know, doing what they can to mitigate the congestion so that goods can move without having these bottlenecks in as much as possible helps ultimately the bottom line from a regional economic perspective.
That makes sense. And as somebody who's been stuck on interstates in California at various times, no clear sight of when I'm going to get to where I want to go, I appreciate all the efforts, whether they're at the ports or anywhere.
Time is money.
Exactly. Brad, do you have any use cases that you can share with us from your perspective on this?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few that come to mind around, you know, the topic of why invest more in connected vehicles, right? So we look at things like the amount of time that a vehicle is at an upfitter, or, you know, as soon as a vehicle hits the lot, I can notify the driver. That driver can go and pick up the vehicle, or, you know, even more tactical things like how much brake life is left on a vehicle. there's limited visibility to all of those areas today, and unless I'm the one who's taking the vehicle into the shop, or I'm the one who's in contact with the specific vendor in a supply chain, I don't have the best visibility to that in all cases today. So, if I can be proactive in telling the driver, as an example, hey, you have 20% of your brake life left, go in and get a brake job. That saves me money in repair time, and it minimizes the downtime. And ultimately, it provides the vehicle with the ability to drive more revenue for that particular business. So, I think the use cases are endless, but it's about finding the meaningful ones and then using that as justification for the investment.
Perfectly said. And Tim, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, so there's lots of monetary benefits, I guess, to these technologies, and lots of ways that they can drive efficiencies for your business and increase your asset utilization and things like that. Beyond those monetary benefits, there are lots of broader social benefits to these technologies if correctly implemented as well. So as we've discussed already, there's benefits in productivity, in enhanced safety for your drivers and your operators, and greater efficiency. And this means cutting tailpipe emissions potentially, reducing congestion, improving traffic flows, reducing particulates from brake wear, from tire wear, and all of this translates to better air quality for people who live in the places where you drive. So this better quality of life and health prospects for folks is not to be overlooked. And many studies have shown that lower demographics in society are disproportionately affected by pollution. So the widespread adoption of these technologies is something that we very much advocate for, because of their potential benefits to those that have the lowest economic means, if you will.
All right. And we've spent pretty much this whole time specifically talking about CAVs, but since we're looking at the road ahead in the next couple of years, I think we should just touch very, very quickly on autonomous vehicles. And Brian, is there anything about those that we should be considering, or just not, and making sure that we're keeping things in consideration as we're looking at the road ahead?
Yeah, there's a lot of work. I mentioned the company Local Motors. They're working on a vehicle that would be referred to as a shared autonomous vehicle. It's purely autonomous, a shared autonomous shuttle. And these vehicles can move 9 to 12 people at any given time. They're used in pilot settings right now. There's installation in the Central Business District in Las Vegas. And there's several pilots all across the country. And so one of the things that these types of vehicles can help is that first and last mile. If you imagine in your neighborhood a roving a shared autonomous shuttle that you could call on your phone and jump on and have that vehicle take you to your local transit station. And similarly, on the other end of that trip, you can have that same type of vehicle bring you to your work. So it is seen as an opportunity to address what we call first and last mile, or FALM. And so the aspiration there is that we can get an increase transit ridership, which is definitely suffering across the U.S. right now. So that there's agencies that are looking at that as a means to explore how that can be woven into the transportation system fabric.
That's actually really interesting, because you also hear in other industries that how they could leverage that autonomous vehicle even for replenishment purposes. Things that can go from a DC to a store, for example, on a regularly established route that repeats very easily and very often. So even those types of things are interesting in how they integrate with the rest of a fleet, and with the connected technology as well. But Tim, I was really interested in what you were just saying with regards to the lower emissions and some of the societal and environmental benefits that we could get out of this technology. And it just strikes me that there are just a lot of positive effects outside of just the immediate industry that can be gained. And so from your perspective, I know you already talked a little bit about this, but did you have anything else you wanted to add about any other type of environmental or social benefits of CAVs?
Sure. I mean, the impact of road accidents cannot be overstated. So they, aside from the immediate, people that are injured and killed on the roads every day, the economic cost of those collisions is outstanding. It's really horrifying. Aside from lost productivity and all the people that end up in a traffic jam on their way to work, so the economic cost of road accidents is multiples of the number of people that are killed. And then, more broadly, if we think about a more efficient transportation ecosystem, as you mentioned with your experience of California's freeways, if we're all able to spend less time commuting or at least recover our commute time, then, there's more opportunities for economic productivity and, a better quality of life for your workforce there as well. And then as Brian was mentioning, when you imagine how these shuttles can be used locally, there's really an opportunity to offer access to mobility for people that are either underserved by existing mobility solutions and not able to connect the dots with existing public transit, or provide mobility services to those that are perhaps blind or disabled or unable to have their own independence of movement. So across the board, again, the broader benefits of connected and automated vehicle technologies are quite substantial.
And Brian, you had mentioned, obviously some things around ports, but can you weigh in on the environmental and social benefits you see just with some of the technology that's being adapted there?
Yeah. Before I get into the environmental thing, but one thing that Tim mentioned that just to talk about in the environment of COVID. So unfortunately, those most affected by COVID are of lower socioeconomic means, folks that do need to use public transit to get places. And one of the things that agencies are needing to do because of physical distancing requirements is to make sure that there's fewer people on the bus than what they were built for, right? And one of the things that we see as an opportunity here is if we can get sensors into those vehicles and monitor the number of passengers in the vehicle, you get a real-time information so you understand when this bus is coming and if there's a seat available, which is going to be challenging during these times. So I think that's just one use case where we could provide improved benefit to folks that are reliant upon transit to make it through their day. But in regards to the environmental benefits, transportation is the #1 cause of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. And the biggest contributor to that is vehicles idling in congestion. So picture your California freeways where vehicles stuck in traffic. That's the worst case scenario. During those situations, that's when you have an increased amount of emissions and pollutants in the air. And this was seen through measures of incidence of asthma in West Oakland, which is where the Port of Oakland is. And so immediately that was one of the driving factors in the improvements that were done at the Port of Oakland. Let's get vehicles so that they can move better, that they're not stuck in traffic. We don't want trucks idling and queuing up at the terminals. Let's keep them moving. And that ultimately will provide social benefit by bringing down the particulates and hopefully reducing the number of incidents of asthma in that area.
All right. Well, we're running out of time here, so I don't want to neglect questions that we've had come in from the audience. So thank you all so much for the conversation so far. But let's take a couple questions here. And just a reminder to everyone listening, please drop any questions you have in the chat. But the first question we have is this one. How serious are OEMs and policymakers considering the shift in how we travel because of these innovations? Or is the primary discussion based on today's personal vehicle and fleet use model with higher efficiencies? Anybody want to take a first stab at that question?
I can speak to the policymaker side of things, I think.
Okay.
So many, particularly local authorities, are looking at how connected and automated vehicles will impact their decision making and their transportation ecosystem in the very near future. So whilst in the US at least, You know, autonomous vehicles are regulated a little bit at the federal level and largely at the state level. Cities and local authorities are the ones that will actually have to interact with these things the most. So they're considering, you know, given that I already have, say, a gridlock city and a public transit ecosystem, how do these vehicles interact with these things, and how does it impact my decision making about my infrastructure and things like curbstones, parking spaces, all the things that I have to make decisions on in the near future, as well as the safety of my citizens. So we've done a few projects in recent years where we've, you know, been advising governments, local authorities that are unable to actually regulate these things, just on how they can advocate effectively to make sure that their priorities are heard for ensuring that, you know, their future mobility ecosystem is well set to benefit from these things. And the most optimistic among those are looking and saying, hey, how can we use these technologies to enhance our public transit experience? You know, like the example that Brian mentioned earlier, how can we use this to get more people using our shared modes rather than encouraging private car use and increasing congestion?
And Brian or Brad, do either of you want to weigh in on this?
Sure. I mean, I would just add, you know, from a personal vehicle versus fleet perspective, a lot of the main focus from the OEMs is just inherently going to be on the corporate fleets or the public sector or private sector fleets, because that's where a lot of the unknowns can come to fruition, and we can get some clarity there in terms of what is the right policy or what is the right approach in certain situations before it gets rolled out more on a retail basis from a personal vehicle perspective. So, you know, Brian had alluded to, you know, trucking and closed circuit transportation. That's clearly a near term focus versus, you know, somebody who's going to be using these types of features on a retail basis off of a lot or a vehicle that they're procuring personally.
Right. And Brian, did you have anything you wanted to add, or?
Yeah, just real quick, I'd say that in the two avenues here would be on from the fleet perspective, as Brad mentioned. I think investments are being made to at the production line level to not necessarily on personal vehicles, but on fleet vehicles with new types of technology embedded. In regards to the OEMs, really a lot of the things that we're seeing are things like Ford Mobility, you know, who are putting in Ford electric bikes in our central business districts, right? So the idea of a company getting behind moving as opposed to buying a vehicle is a complete paradigm shift. And this all started in 2012 when Uber and Lyft came along, and everyone realized, well, guess what? This idea of owning a vehicle is no longer the American dream. People would just need to get around.
And I'm going to sneak one last question in here that kind of tails off of this, and that's, you know, is there a concern that, you know, as you're looking at vehicles that have all this technology in it, as operators, are you going to be locked into one particular manufacturer, or is the technology flexible enough that it can kind of, you know, regardless of which manufacturer you might purchase your vehicles from, you can still make it all work together? Maybe Brad, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, you definitely can. You know, and that's definitely the goal, and that's where a normalizer comes into play. You know, so as I'm sourcing vehicles from different manufacturers, I want the same experience across those OEMs. And, you know, there's a lot of value in that, and it's a lot of dialogue and consideration, you know, when choosing a vendor, and, you know, what can they provide versus what others can provide from a competitive standpoint.
All right. Any last thoughts, Brian or Tim? We're good? All right. That brings us really right to the top of the hour. So I just want to thank everyone on our panel today. I think this has been a great conversation. I've definitely I had a really great time getting to know all of you and to talk about all of these topics. And to everyone who dialed in, thank you so much for your time. Please stay safe, stay well. And, you know, you'll hear from a follow-up email about some additional resources that may be available to you. So with that, thank you so much.